Okay, Neili, before we get into your parents and the Holocaust and their lives, let's tell us something about you.
My
Introduce
pleasure.
yourself.
Okay. First of all, it's important that you know that in Judaism, invariably, you name a new child after someone who is deceased. And because of my father and mother's history, their choice was, well, more my father than
Mm.
my mother, to name me in honor of all of those who were deceased in the Holocaust. So my name is Neili. If you would spell it the way in transliteration in Hebrew, it would be Nili. My folks chose to spell it Nieli. In the book of Samuel's,
Mhm.
the translation is Neili, the Jewish nation will always survive.
Mhm.
And that's what I was named after. And in addition, what is interesting for your audience to know, at the turn of the 20th century, um, the Turks were in Palestine. At the time when uh, Herzl, Theodore Herzl was a no, wasn't a politician, he was a journalist, and he said, there's too much going on, there's too much anti-Semitism, Jews have to go back to their homeland. And he encouraged the movement back to Palestine. But Palestine was controlled by the Turks, and the Turks were giving the new immigrants a very difficult time.
Mhm.
And the Jewish community wanted very much to have the British come in. There was a terrorist organization which was started by the Abramson family, if I'm not mistaken, and their um, sign was Neili.
Hmm.
They caused trouble for the Turks.
Hmm.
Well, I very often cause trouble too. I try not to hurt too many
Mhm.
people, but that's what it was. So I'm named after the book of Samuel's and a terrorist organization. So that's who I am.
You introduced me to the term second generation Holocaust survivors.
Yes.
Could you explain a little bit about that?
This was a term that was coined more in Israel than any other place in the world when therapists were asked to address the needs of the children of survivors. It wasn't sufficient that you had been a survivor and you were traumatized, and in many, many ways.
Mhm.
Okay? Um, they spoke to people like me who had been raised by survivors. Now, I can give you one example. I had a very beautiful friend in New York, and we used to exercise together. And I would say to her, well, why don't we go out to lunch? And she said, oh, Neili, let's do something else. Let's go to the theater. I said, fine, let's go to the theater, but why don't you? And invariably, even her husband, who was my husband's friend, they declined when it came to eating. And I once asked her, I said, is it my choice of restaurant? Is there something? She says, Neili, look, I was raised by a mother who was a widow, immigrated to Israel at the end of the Holocaust. And as her only child, she would serve me lunch and she would say, you have to finish everything that's on the plate.
Mm.
And for the past 50 years, I have been anorexic.
Mm.
So when you hear about trauma, look, I was raised by two cuckoo birds. I mean, I can say
Mm.
it, okay? When something happened and my father would get really upset, he would yell.
Mm.
Okay, it took him a second and he controlled himself. And my mother invariably would be in tears once a day.
Mm.
Okay, and I can I can attribute it from my father. For instance, he was interned in Buchenwald, which is a concentration camp, but towards the end of the war,
Mhm.
because he was in a ghetto for many years. But towards the end of the war, he was interned in Buchenwald, and he was a strong fella, and he was a good leader.
Mhm.
And the Gestapo there said, Lieberman, you're going to become a capo. And my father heard capo. A capo was a Jewish policeman. And a capo invariably, whether it was a man or a woman, got better rations, better clothing, better places to live. And the way my father explained it, he got so angry that he started pummeling the policemen, and they beat him to a pulp.
Mm-hmm.
So that from 1944 or 45, my father had a tic. And when he tried to concentrate, invariably his head would shake. They beat him so badly over the head. And we have a funny story in the family when my husband, rest his soul, was chatting with my father. He says, Joe, look, I want to go to medical school. And my father kept going like this. And my husband says, Joe, why do you keep saying no? He says, I'm not saying no. It's just that the head doesn't want to go where I want it to go. So I'm telling you, this was part of his trauma. Okay? But he was extremely bright. When you think of someone who didn't have the opportunity to go to university, he was the oldest of 10, and there were 9 brothers and 1 sister. And he always looked out for the brothers and sisters, always. He was in business in his hometown, and it was a leather goods business. And they concentrated quite a bit. You know the leather seats in the bicycles?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
In his factory, they used to mold it, etc. And his father died young, so he took over the business. But I have to share another story with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
And what happened, here we are, 40, 50 years later. We are in my home with my husband, and my husband had been accepted into Albert Einstein College of Medicine to be an assistant head of the team. And one gentleman used to drive my husband every day to the hospital because we lived in the same neighborhood. And this way my husband could leave me the car. My father came to visit. And my father was a tremendous observer of humanity. He's sitting in the seat in the kitchen, and I introduced, I said, Dad, this is Dr. Kleiner, this is Odette's boss, etc. Hello, sir, fine. And it gets quiet. And all of a sudden, my father turns to Dr. Kleiner. He says, I know you. Your family lived in Częstochowa, Poland, and you have 2 other brothers. And your father had a ball bearing factory in Częstochowa. Well, if this doctor didn't drop dead right in front of my father, and all of us are witnesses. And the man says, how do you know? He says, because my father used to buy equipment from your father. And all of us, we're all standing there, and we didn't know what to do. Could you imagine an experience like that? And then my father says, well, I know that you were able to escape before the war. He says, yes, I went to South Africa. My brother went to Canada. Another one went to the United States. But you do realize the world is that small.
It is. How old was your father when he went to Buchenwald?
My dad was about 38, 39, and he had been married and he had a child. What he did, the Germans annihilated the ghettos. I'm hoping that your listeners know that a ghetto is a gated community, not like you see here in Tennessee. We're not talking about that gated community. They opened it up at 6 in the morning and closed it again at 6 o'clock at night, and it was only for the Jews. And the very, very harsh conditions, sometimes 2 or 3 families living in one apartment at the same time and sharing the facilities. But my mom was interned in a ghetto, and my father was until about 44, and then he was taken to Buchenwald. What is interesting is that one of his brothers, one of the youngest boys, was taken in a sweep to Treblinka, which is also in Poland, and he manages to escape. I don't know, with pliers or whatever, he cut the wires when they weren't electrified, and he escapes. and he escapes to a farm. But en route, he goes and grabs the boots of some SS officer that were lying on the side. And the farmer said to him, I'm going to help you. There is no way that you're going to leave here without food and you stay here and you get back your strength. He says, but the boots have to go. The moment that someone sees those boots, they're going to know that you stole them.
Mm-hmm.
So he gave him soiled shoes. He says, now you can leave. And my uncle came back to the town and he began to tell the townspeople what he had gone through in the couple of months. Do you know what they did? Guess, what did they do? They beat him to a pulp. They said, why are you spreading lies like this? Why are you frightening the population? We are still here with our families and children, and you shouldn't be doing. This is what happened to him.
And that was in Poland?
This in Poland. Look, this is a whole subject on its own.
Yeah.
Okay? Let me just give you an aside about Poland. The other day, I'm reading the new, and this is 2025, and then you'll understand the gist of what I'm trying to say. There were a whole group of Jewish people, young people, coming back from a summer camp experience, and these people were on a Polish LOT. LOT is the Polish Airlines.
Okay.
Okay? And the stewardesses were Polish women. And one of the passengers said to someone later, he says, we were treated like cattle. One of them said, you shouldn't be standing in the aisle. Go sit there over there with the other Jews. When my husband and I went to Poland, and it was very difficult for my husband in his position to refuse a visit. He was active in the European OB Society and the American, etc. And it took him 6 years to convince me to go back to Poland. I said, I don't want to have anything to do with these people. Where were most of the concentration camps? In Poland?
Poland, yeah.
And my husband says, Neili, I have to go. I said, okay. And I went on all the trips because it was our time together. We could take a break from being parents and we could enjoy one another as a couple. And the chairman who really took care of our group of people was a very lovely woman. It was a Polish woman, and she took me in the university town, and we're passing by, and I said, oh, what a magnificent building. She says, oh, this is a synagogue. I said, if you don't mind, I'd like to go in. You know what? Pay my respects. What am I going to do? I just want to see the architecture, etc. She says, oh, no, no, it's no longer a synagogue. We turned it into the town pool. Then I got quiet. Could you imagine me being quiet? Anyway, another time.
And now, what year was that?
1996.
Okay, so that's pretty recent. It's a long time after the war.
It's never a long time after the war when you talk about the Polacks.
Yeah.
And the other time, what was it? Oh, yeah. I don't know if we were in Warsaw, if we were at the university, I'm not sure. I said to my husband, I said, you know what, that bakery, the aroma coming out of that bakery is something quite extraordinary. Let me go in and get some rolls. We'll have it with coffee. We'll call it breakfast. Okay? And at the time, I wore the tiniest Magen David, the Jewish star. This little girl that you saw, this Remy, she has since confiscated it. Okay, she's Nini, I need it. So I don't have it today, but I had it in 96. And I go into the shop, and the shopkeeper sees the small, and I didn't even have a chance to make my request of what I would like to order. One tells the other, and I understand Polish, one tells the other, she says, take a look, we got a Jewish woman here. I thought we finished them all. You know how quickly I lost my appetite?
I'd say immediately.
And then I responded in Polish. I said, thank you very much. I decided that I wasn't going to be rude. My job is not to respond the way she. Could you imagine? Could
Yeah.
you imagine?
Yeah.
We had another interesting experience. Invariably, um, the Polish people who hosted us were very excited to speak to my husband.
Mm-hmm.
They even gave him an honorary doctorate. They were
Mm.
very thrilled that his area was gestational diabetes, or diabetes with the onset of pregnancy. And he came out with a regimen that wasn't being used. He insisted that the women didn't need insulin. And
Mm.
he did the studies, etc. And today, because they were fearful that a woman might develop gestational diabetes and then it would go on to the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
They were interested in talking to him. And we would sit around a table like this in the restaurants or whatever. I don't know, they always picked on me.
Mm.
I don't know why it was. Someone would whisper behind, and pani means madam. Pani Langerova, and they knew I understood Polish. I'm a Jew. And then quietly
Mm.
walk around. I said, okay, fine. Another time, someone else said, I'm Jewish. And then we had the opportunity to sit just with certain people. And I said, why do you feel the need to tell me your religious affiliation? He says, because at the university, if they would know that we were Jewish,
Mm.
we wouldn't even be able to dream about being assistant, associate, or full
Mm-hmm.
professor. They said to me, you are now in Poland.
Mm-hmm. Now, your mother was born in Poland, right?
My mother was
Yeah.
Polish. My father was Polish. Yes.
Okay. Your father. Okay.
My mother, very interesting. My mother was in the ghetto. And the only thing that she took out of the ghetto was a small comb, was an ivory comb.
You still have it?
I'll tell you the
Yeah.
story of the ivory comb. And she passed it on to me. And the significance, my mother always was
Mm-hmm.
very dainty, very clean, and very elegant. She didn't like the idea that she had knits. I forgot what you're not, um, that you get when you're in an enclosed space, that you wouldn't be clean. She used this comb
Mm.
every day, 2, 3 times a day, to make sure her hair was clean.
Mm.
And this is the only thing that remained. When my granddaughter was born, when Maya was born, I gave this to my daughter. I said, she was taking the child to the synagogue for the naming. I said, I want your daughter to have
Mm-hmm.
this comb because it was significant to her great grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
It's significant to me. So, what is money? Money can't replace that
No,
comb.
you can't. That's no, no. Now going back to your father, um, well, why don't you describe the ghetto life a little bit because I don't think people understand today, and then we'll go back to your father.
Ghetto life was okay. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I'm not trying to be rude,
Yeah.
please. You know it because I was blown away. I was completely blown away. My son-in-law was in our home many years ago, and he says, Neili, I'm reading an incredible book. I said, share. He says, there's this monk who was doing a study of the different places of incarceration of Jews in World War II. I said, that's very, I said, and does he have the source? He says, he's got all the sources and he wrote a book. So now I'm going to ask you, Jim, how many places of incarceration, prison camps, concentration camps, ghettos, etc., did the Germans create?
As far as the ghettos, I know there were over 1,000.
Okay,
Just ghettos.
right.
I don't know about the concentration camps because they had sub camps
Right.
everywhere.
Give me a
So
number.
I would say 100 concentration camps
Plus the ghettos.
plus the
Are
ghettos.
you sitting comfortably? I don't
Yeah,
want
yeah,
you to.
yeah. I'm good.
No,
Yeah,
I look good. I'm glad. I don't want you to fall off the
I won't
sofa.
fall off.
Okay,
No.
hold on to the side. There were 44,000 internment camps created by the Nazis.
Wow. Does that include the?
The concentration camps, prisoner of war camps,
Hmm.
ghettos, 44,000. And I checked it again because I knew that I wanted to share this number with you.
Yeah.
Okay? And a ghetto, it's difficult to describe. What do we mean by a closed community? They built gates, and the people were roused out of their homes.
Mm-hmm.
They were forced into, because you wanted segregation of Jews from non-Jews. And this started almost immediately,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Because the philosophy was, um, amongst the Germans, the Nazis, etc., Jews are vermin. We don't want them in our midst. They need to be separated from the rest of humanity. Okay? And you must also go back to German mythology. They thought that they were superior race.
Mm-hmm.
But they inculcated that in their culture.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, blonde, tall, distinguished looking, blue eyes, to the extent that even when Germany took over Norway and Sweden, they encouraged the soldiers to take out the pretty blonde
Mm-hmm.
Norwegian and Swedish women, impregnate them so
Mm-hmm.
that they would also be part of the superior race. Do you know the Bee Gees?
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, you're my generation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the Bee Gees is the daughter of a woman who was impregnated by an officer, and for the rest of her life, when she learned, she couldn't accept that this had happened to her mother.
It's
This was for the sake of having a superior race.
it's funny all the things that they tried to quantify to be a superior race. Hitler didn't fit in any of them. He wasn't tall. He wasn't blonde. He was
He was an outstanding orator.
Yeah.
But you see, I must tell you, Jim, if you are if you're talking to a population, and let's go back a little bit, Germany was part of World War One,
Mm-hmm.
and Germany lost World War One, okay, with the Turks, etc. And Germany lost to France and to Great Britain. And psychologically, when you think that you're a great people, this was a tremendous psychological blow to the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can recover if you have other assets. Germany was forced to sign the peace treaty
Mm-hmm.
and take responsibility. Now, that is a blow.
Mm-hmm.
And that was advertised.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not enough that you lost the war. You were blamed for being part of the war of the Axis powers, and you had to pay reparations.
Mm-hmm.
So Germany had to pay reparations to France and to Great Britain.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they paid to the United States, but you know what? But the United States demanded reparations from France. Hey, we helped you win the war. So they had to, and all of this also contributed to the Depression.
Yes.
And that occurs during the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a series of events that occur, and they don't occur in a vacuum. It's one thing over another one, and what you've done, you've crushed a people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy for someone like a Mickey Mouse, and if you ever want to see an incredible, incredible movie, then you see Charlie Chaplin's rendition of Hitler. And it's a silent movie, but it is brilliant because you think that you're watching Hitler on the stage. Okay, so you have a demoralized nation that wants to be great, and so it was right for a Hitler.
Yeah, yeah.
And take that, and then take the hatred of Jews. Now, listen, we got to go back to the hatred of Jews. As long as I don't make people feel uncomfortable, this is not my opinion. This is history. Okay, you're talking about Judaism, which is over 5,000 years old. And one of the most important things that the Jews contributed to the world was the Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and not only the Ten Commandments, but the concept of ethical monotheism. In other words, I'm giving you one God, monotheism, that is ethical, that teaches you how to behave to your fellow man, how we can live together in this environment. and you put that juxtapose that gives you the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a god for rain and a god for drying up the rain, and you got another god for one thing and a god. You had polytheism, and very rarely did you have a culture that was willing to accept the idea of monotheism,
Mm-hmm.
and that you have to treat your fellow man as another human being, as you would your family. Okay, so when you talk about that, then you have to go back to a world. I give you Poland as an example. Why did we have the pogroms? Why did they try
Mm-hmm.
to murder? Because you're talking about a very ignorant population
Mm-hmm.
for many, many um, centuries. And whatever the priest said was holy, because
Mm-hmm.
most of them couldn't read and write.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the priests used to say, well, when the Jews make their matzah for Passover, they also distill the blood of Christian children, and that's what makes the matzah taste good. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not telling you a story, I'm telling
Oh
you the
yeah, yeah.
truth. And when you do this one year after the other, you're talking about Christianity, which was anti-Semitic. Now, again, you got to go back to history. This is like 500 AD. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
500. Okay, we're starting a different era, and in fact, you no longer had the Roman Empire,
Mm-hmm.
and you didn't have any reasonable nation. They were all, pieced together, and you had a system where everything was based on agriculture. And the only normal, civilized, and rational institution was the church.
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about ignorant people. You're not going to behave. You're going to be excommunicated. You're not going to be buried like a Christian. You're not going to go to heaven. And you're talking about not 21st century level of intelligence and knowledge. You're talking about the 6th century,
Mm-hmm.
and being excommunicated was worse than you could possibly imagine. So when they tell you, go kill the Jews, you go and you went and you killed the Jews. The Roman Catholic Church was insidious to the Jews because the Jews wouldn't accept Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he was one of ours was negligible. It didn't make a difference. You didn't accept Jesus, you had to be excommunicated, you had to be crucified. And the Roman Catholic Church um, insisted on the pogroms. They were behind it very, very often.
A lot of people don't know what the term pogroms is. Can you go into that?
I'm going to try, in other words, it was a raid. That's the best expression.
Mm-hmm.
You know what they say, the Indians raided the
Mm-hmm.
cowboys? We're talking about a raid. Someone incited, and a lot of it happened in Russia.
Yeah.
You incite a group of people, you say, the Jews have just gotten such and such. Let's finish them. So now I want to go back to something. The most significant economic basis within Europe at the time, okay, was land. Land was everything. But the Roman Catholic Church didn't allow Jews to own land.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do? You have to have a means of earning a living. So land means that you could plant for yourself and that you could also plant and sell at the market.
Mm-hmm.
But Jews were forbidden to do that. What are you going to do? No, it's a
You,
rhetorical question.
yeah. You.
Listen, Jim, I don't expect you to answer. I don't. In other words, most people don't understand the logic. Why did I tell you that Jews were always very handy? Jews had to have professions that were portable.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a seamstress, you could put the needle and thread in the hem of your dress and you could move. If you were a doctor, you could take your tools and you could move. If you were a furrier, the things that you used to skin the furs, you could take with you. Jews had portable professions. Okay? The other thing, I hope I haven't forgotten my train of thought. I wanted to tell you something. I'm sure it'll come to me. Um, okay. In Christianity, it was against the tenets of the Roman Catholic Christian Church that you loan me money and charge an exorbitant interest rate.
Mm-hmm.
That's not part of Judaism because the Jews were very practical. I gave you $10. I'm going to charge you 10%, whatever it. Why? Because the time that the money was in your hands, it wasn't in my hands and I couldn't use it. It was rent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you have the concept of Shakespeare, the Merchant of Venice. Do you know that there are places in the world today where the Merchant of Venice is never shown because it would talk about a usurer, the merchant who charged money for the rental of them. It was rent. You were actually charging someone rent. But when the kings and they consolidated the lands of Europe, who were the kings going to go to? Who had money? When they began to open up the Middle East and they began to open up America, in other words, North America, South America, and you had the beginning of explorations. Who had the money? The Jews had the money. Mm-hmm. So today, in 2025, I'm sitting at the Y, and this gentleman approaches, Neili, can I sit and talk to you? I said, my pleasure, come on. Get yourself coffee. He says, how come you Jews have so much money? I said, that's the first thing you want to ask me? You don't want to ask me, how come I speak like I'm from New York? You don't want to talk to me about things that concern, why do Jews have money? I said, you know what? I think this conversation is over. Go read your history books and then we can have another conversation.
Yeah.
There are concepts, but you need to also understand other things. Jews are not smarter than other people. It's just they have cultural components that push them into certain professions. When Jews lived in the shtetls, in other words, the small communities, okay, every Jewish boy at the age of 3 was enrolled in school. Every little boy went to have lessons with the rabbi. Every little boy of 3 learned how to read. Not only did he learn how to read, but he also learned what we call in Hebrew pilpul. And pilpul means if I give you a scenario, give me the potential outcomes. Mm-hmm. In other words, not only am I teaching you logic, I'm teaching you strategy. And I know that you cannot inherit tangible things. In other words, just because your father was a lawyer doesn't mean you're going to become a lawyer. But certain things do go down the generations. Mm-hmm. You've got Jewish lawyers because they are taught, even today at a young age, a way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And a Jewish mother will say, it's not a problem. You could really be whatever you want. You've got 2 choices. You want to be a doctor or you want to be a lawyer, but it's up to you. I'm not going to push you.
Yeah.
We can't help, and it's not because a Jewish mother needs a doctor or a lawyer, but it has come down through the ages. Those professions are portable. Mm-hmm. When they take, forget the fact that you need a license in every state. That's secondary, but the knowledge is there. Do you follow what I'm saying? A way of thinking is there. You think that the Indian community here in Jersey, my daughter has a wonderful, wonderful Indian friend. She talks the same way to her sons. You could be whatever you want. You could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer. I'm giving you a choice, but you better choose. Because there are certain things that are ingrained in a culture. That's all that I'm saying. Not that one culture is better than another. I would never say that. But there are certain characteristics and certain ambitions. You know what? If for a Jewish mother to have a doctor, you can't talk to her. My son, the doctor. But I'm telling you, because I had 2 in-laws, and my son-in-laws were doctors. You couldn't talk to them because they were the mother the mothers of Jewish doctors. They were holy.
Hmm.
Don't ask.
Hmm.
I'm making fun. I'm making fun, but I know my own people.
Mm-hmm.
I know, you know, when when we were in Israel so many years ago, my husband was a phenomenal teacher. When you talk about someone who can ignite kids, he was, and he taught chemistry, he was quite extraordinary. And he comes to the house and he tells his mother and father, well, I will be enrolling in medical school. And my father-in-law said, but you have such a talent for teaching. He says, the way you teach, the way you can engage the students is a gift from God. And I'll never forget, my mother-in-law said, be quiet. I want a doctor.
So it's
This
kind of a
is culture.
status thing too,
You
yeah.
know what it is? Again, not the status. It's not the status. You know what it is? It's really more, it goes back centuries. It goes back centuries. If there's a problem, you could come to another country, do the licensing exam. You already have a profession.
Mm.
It's part of who we are as people, and we can't forget the rationale of why certain people went into certain professions. Okay? The Rothschilds had 10 kids. And the father said, even to the daughters, we know how to make money. And then you started the Rothschild banking industry.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? He says, when you have money and you can go from one place to another, we'll always be able to eat.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to allow us to own land.
Mm-hmm.
What else you want to know?
Let's go back to your father. And I know you told me he didn't talk about his experiences in the camp. Um, but when did you first realize that
That he was a
he
nutcase? I'll tell you. Okay. First of all, it's not just my father. Because the same as look, I'm enjoying this. I'm having the time of my life. I hope you're not suffering here. But I want to tell you, if I learned how to be hospitable and the pleasure, but the pleasure of having people in my home was only from my father. My mother enjoyed it. But when my father heard that my mother had invited people, he went completely cuckoo.
Hmm.
Pulled out the folding table and he put it in the living room and he made a list of things that my mother was supposed to buy. And you would have 20 or 30 people sitting around the table and nobody spoke about the camps.
What did they talk about?
Okay. My father started a business, another one started another business, someone else did something else. Or someone would say, oh, I have a cousin who introduced me to how they began again in America. That's what they spoke about. I have a child who's going to the university. He's interested in this. What do you think? Those kind of things. Nobody spoke about the camps. And there were several reasons why. These immigrants learned very early on that people didn't want to hear the horror stories.
Hmm.
Some people would say, no, I don't believe you. That's not possible. And my husband, because I used to ask him because it was different when immigrants came to Israel and different when immigrants came to the United States. And many Israelis, young 20s, 30s, they would say, why didn't you fight back? What do you mean they took you to the trains and they put you on trains? They didn't. Again, Israelis are very, acerbic, and what do you mean you didn't fight back? That's not possible. You went in like cows to slaughter, and nobody did because nobody knew where they were going. Nobody understood because if you read the book by what's the guy who wrote Tuesdays with Maury? What's his name? I forgot. Oh, it'll come to me when I'm in the shower. 1 second. He recently wrote a book, and it's called The Little Liar. The book is quite extraordinary. It was written a year or two ago. The SS convinced a little boy of 6 or 7 that if you help us, round up the Jews and bring them to the trains, we're going to spare your parents. So that's what he did. They didn't tell the Jews, you're going to a concentration camp. That's why they beat up my uncle, because they didn't know they were going into a prison. They said, no, we're relocating the Jews. Yes, dear. Mitch Albom, exactly. Mitch Albom. Great book. You got to get the book. Anyway, they didn't say, we're sending you to a concentration camp. Very, very few people actually knew the terminology. We are relocating. You're going as a family. But when they came, let's say to Auschwitz or Treblinka, children were pushed aside. They were taken immediately to the gas chambers. Pretty women were sent as hooers for the Germans. Anyone who had any kind of profession, they singled them out. Good, you can sew for us. You can be a furrier. You can do this. In Majdanek, which was a strictly female camp, that became a mecca because for some reason, there were so many musicians that were interned there. And if you watch movies, Redgrave, I think was I forgot her name, whatever. She was a violinist, and she created an orchestra. So there were, each place was different, and each place was known for something else. Now, my father, first of all, they didn't talk about it. Okay,
correct.
They didn't talk, and you understand the logic.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
However, as a child, I would hear all kinds of stories, and I was a very good listener. And because I was the only child in the family, I also absorbed the good, bad, the ugly. I absorbed everything, and it was a question of time where I could differentiate. Okay. My father, and they always thought I didn't understand. No way that Neili understands Polish, but a language is like music. You hear it, and then you begin to sing the melody, and you begin to know the words, and you begin to understand the nuances. My father comes home and begins to tell my mother a story. He says, look, let's talk quietly. So Neili doesn't understand. They found out that such and such female was a couple. And we lived in Brighton Beach. It's the southern part of Brooklyn. Perhaps, maybe you remember Brighton Beach Memoirs.
No.
Okay, it's not important. But during the 1960s, the Russian community began to move into Brighton Beach. Today, Brighton Beach is just Russian Jews because it's reminiscent of being in the Crimea, etc. Pardon me, and they moved in. But when I was a little girl, Brighton Beach was a completely Jewish community of Ashkenazi Jews, not Sephardi. I'll tell you about that too. Not Sephardi, Ashkenazi Jews from Poland, from whatever. Many, I won't say many, but there were a certain number of immigrants who needed revenge. And they found this particular woman, and I knew the woman. And they invited her like to a party, etc. They put her in a blanket, and they took her under the boardwalk, and they beat the shit out of her.
The couple.
The couple,
yeah,
Jewish woman.
Yeah.
They wanted to eat. They wanted to survive. Look, I'm not blaming. I'm not sentencing anybody. I'm giving you reality. And I heard of many, many situations like this.